Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. We are in lecture 4 of our Neurotheology lecture series, and we are now ready to use functional imaging to begin exploring whether the brain actually has neural networks dedicated to faith. And much of this work has been done by Professor Newberg, whose name we've already mentioned. And he actually uses not functional MRI, but another technique called SPECT scanning, single photon emission tomography, or single photon emission computed tomography, as it's known in the parlance. And what he did is image people in prayer. And the way SPECT scanning works is areas of brain activation get an increase of blood volume and metabolism. And SPECT scanning is able to measure that. The scans are not anatomically accurate like MRI scans, but they allow a much greater flexibility in what you're able to do as you are being scanned or as the radioactive tracer is being injected to map the brain. And so the way these scans work is that red areas like this or like this denote areas of increased activity. And so when he imaged Catholic nuns focusing on a catechism, here's the baseline scan where they are just in a relaxed state. And we're looking at an area in the frontal lobe that's sometimes known as the attention area or the control area. And when they start to pray, and this is a uniform finding that's been replicated across multiple subjects, we note increased activation in the frontal area right here. So there's a definite difference between a relaxed state and a state of prayer. And one of the differences is increased activation in the frontal lobe in the attention area or control area. And another difference in comparing a baseline scan to a prayer scan, other than the attention or control area that we've talked about before, is activation of a language center area that is lighting up during prayer. So we then begin to see that the brain does have areas which become active during prayer, during spiritual connection, and that they make some sense. A language area becomes active. An attention area becomes active, a language area becomes active, and so forth. Now, for the next difference, I would like to spend a few minutes talking to you about a very interesting neurological syndrome. This is from a paper that we published some years back. And this was one of the anatomic scans we looked at when I was talking to you about anatomic scanning with MRI. And we said that this patient had a stroke in the left parietal lobe. And this stroke, or infarct, to use a more precise medical term, produced a very interesting clinical syndrome known as alien hand syndrome. Now, what is that? Well, to understand what that is, we need to talk a little bit about some of the things that we take completely for granted in the brain because they kind of work subconsciously beneath the surface. But this area in the parietal lobe helps with orientation and body limits. Let me give you an example. When you wake up in the morning, you don't have a problem knowing that here's my head and here's the pillow, and that the head belongs to me, but the pillow is a separate thing. It's not part of my head. That's to give you a very gross example. But that is actually a brain function. The brain does that. It sets those limits on where is my body? Where does it begin? Where does it end? How is my body related to other things next to my body, and so forth? And what alien hand syndrome is a stroke in this area actually sets off a cascade where we can no longer define those limits. So this particular patient woke up in her bed screaming that there was a cut off arm in the bed next to her, sort of like if you've ever seen The Godfather, movie with the head of the horse cut off in the bed and so forth. And that was because she could no longer recognize that her right arm was part of her body. She thought it was someone else's severed arm laying next to her in bed. And understanding that our hands belong to us and that we can control them and so forth, that is an automatic function, but it's still a function of the brain, and it can become disrupted. And one of the things that happens with alien hand syndrome is that the hand that we lose control of, that we lose recognition of, can start to act on its own as if it is an alien hand. And there have been very interesting cases reported in the medical literature where the alien hand, for example, every time a smoker would light up a cigarette, the alien hand would come up, take the cigarette, and throw it away, because that hand is now acting not under the person's conscious control, but under, in a sense, its own control. There have been cases where an alien hand has tried to swerve someone off the road as they're driving a car. Of course, again, to stress that alien hand belongs to them, but they no longer can recognize it as theirs or control it as theirs. There have been cases where the alien hand attempted to strangle the person and so forth. So the bottom line is that the left parietal lobe contains a body orientation area that sets limits on where our body begins and where our body ends. Now, why did we go through this whole orientation about this bizarre and rare neurological syndrome? The reason we did is because another very interesting thing was noted in the SPECT scans of those who prayed. In the baseline scan, we see that the orientation area is active. Then in deep spiritual prayer, it actually becomes less active. And this has been interpreted as a sense of loss of personal boundaries of space and time. And perhaps you have had this experience in very deep prayer. We sort of lose ourselves. We are almost unaware of our body, of how much time has elapsed. And there may even be a sense of communion with the divine that has been described by some, or a sense of blending in to the greater universe or greater creation. And this is very well correlated with this notion that now the orientation area and the personal boundary area actually gets suppressed so that we lose ourselves in something bigger. So I find that a very, very interesting correlate to prayer. And so we start to see that indeed the brain does function in very, very particular ways during the deep religious experience. And now let us look at a beautiful verse and perhaps a unique attribute to Muslim prayer, to our salah, because these experiments were done with all sorts of religious people. But let us first look at the verse. So in Surah Al-Baqarah, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam is praised as a truly righteous person, and one of the lofty praises heaped upon him is إذ قال له ربه أسلم قال أسلمت لرب العالمين. When his sustainer said to him, surrender thyself unto me, he answered, I have surrendered myself unto thee, the sustainer of all the worlds. So we in our salah have this notion of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Professor Newberg actually did a case series of the neurophysiological effects of altered states of mind during intense Islamic prayer, during our salah. So he studied now specifically Muslims in their prayer. And very interestingly, he found, this is one patient here, this is a second patient here, and we're just going to focus on this finding in the frontal lobe. Here's the baseline scan where the person is just relaxed. And here, when they are intense and deep in their salah, you notice that the red here goes away. And what did we say about the red? It's partially the attention area and partially the control area, or the executive control function of the brain, where I feel that I am controlling things. When I need to be in control of something and very carefully and deliberately manage it and control it, this area lights up and becomes red. So in prayer, when we submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we actually suppress that control area. And here's another patient. In the baseline state, the control area is active. In intense prayer, the control area now becomes inactive. And this is now a direct quote from Professor Newberg's paper. It is hypothesized that the changes in brain activity may be associated with feelings of surrender and connectedness with God, described to be experienced during these intense Islamic prayer practices. So, subhanAllah, to me, this is quite amazing that there are such close brain correlates to the feelings that we experience during prayer. And as a control, if you will, here is the Muslim praying, and here he is in the relaxed state. Then when he prays, he surrenders to God, and the executive control area becomes suppressed. Now, here are images of an atheist who does not believe in God, but who practices meditation. And he was asked to meditate about the concept of God. So this is somebody well-versed in meditation, who meditates deeply, and they were asked to meditate about the idea of God. And the attention and control area doesn't change between the baseline relaxed state and the deep meditation state. Why? Because although he is meditating about God, he does not believe in God and does not surrender himself to God. And so this is, again, a quote from Professor Newberg. We also looked at the brain of a long-term meditator who was also an atheist. We scanned the person at rest, and while meditating on the concept of God, the results showed that there was no significant increase in the frontal lobes as with other meditation practices. He's talking here about comparison to the nuns who were paying very close attention to their prayers, but that comparison is equally valid to the Muslim who surrenders themselves to God. And the implication is that the individual was not able to activate the structures usually involved in meditation when he was focusing on a concept that he did not believe in. And we would add that in comparison to Islamic prayers, he was also not able to have a sense of surrender to God when he was meditating about God. So you see that there is a very genuine difference between believers and unbelievers, and very specific brain correlates to religious and spiritual practice. Now, we said that SPECT scanning is not as anatomically accurate as MRI, and these initial studies have now been followed by other studies that have used functional MRI scanning to look at the neural correlates of religious and non-religious belief. And what have they found? Because, and here's another paper, by the way, the neural basis of religious cognition. And so you see that these papers now, paper after paper, are finding brain correlates to the exercise of spirituality, that there are brain areas that become active when we practice religiosity, when we are doing our spiritual connection, whether that is a Christian prayer or a Jewish prayer or an Islamic prayer or a Buddhist prayer. areas, specific areas of the brain are involved in doing this. And these areas have been very carefully mapped now, even though this whole scientific endeavor is in its infancy. But these are a variety of areas in the brain, and you would need, pretty much a PhD in neuroanatomy to kind of know all of these things. But suffice it to say that the studies have identified a set of brain networks important to religious cognition. And they include things in the inferior frontal gyrus, the medial prefrontal cortex, the temporal parietal junction, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and so on and so forth. I don't want to just keep spouting names. If you're not heavily involved in neuroscience, these names won't mean much. But the important conclusion is that functional MRI imaging and SPECT scanning have now begun to find a set of brain networks that function very specifically and very particularly in prayer and spirituality. And so here is a blurb about, again, the conclusions of these studies. And one of the papers, or the differences, compared religious beliefs to non-religious beliefs. So you may say, well, when we believe something, anything, the brain has an area that lets us believe. But it turns out that religious beliefs work different. So when I tell you, for example, do you believe that a squared plus b squared equals c squared in a right triangle? If you've studied math and the Pythagorean theorem, you believe that. You know that. If you've studied geography, you know Canberra is the capital of Australia. If I tell you that, do you believe that? Yes, I believe that. These are non-religious beliefs. It turns out that religious beliefs actually operate by a different brain network. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in heaven? Do you believe in hell? Do you believe that we will be judged? Those beliefs are different than these beliefs, and they work with a different and a specific brain network. And so the bottom line now is that there is not a distinct God spot in the brain, if you'll excuse the terminology, meaning there's not one specific center like we talked about Broca's area for speech, where if you wipe out that center, the person can't speak. There isn't a specific brain area that if you wipe out that area, now the person will go from being a believer to being an atheist. No. However, the studies have found that there are very, very particular and dedicated brain networks that work together in a complex way to subtend the religious experience. And so from this article, we have found a neuropsychological basis for spirituality, but it's not isolated to one specific area of the brain. And spirituality is a much more dynamic concept that uses many parts of the brain, and certain parts of the brain play more predominant roles, but they all work together to facilitate individual spiritual experiences. And so what science is now showing us is it does seem that indeed we are born with a brain capacity, a hardwiring for the spiritual experience, brain networks that are dedicated to just this particular experience, with definite differences between religious beliefs and non-religious beliefs, with definite differences in the way the brains of atheists work, even when they're meditating about God, compared to the brains of believers. So this to me is absolutely amazing stuff. It is basically now saying that science is indeed discovering that perhaps the interpretation of verse 172 of Surah Al-A'raf, that indeed religiosity is innate, it is now finding very, very strong scientific support, even though, once again, I caution you, this area is still in its infancy. I hope you are finding this material as interesting and as inspiring as I am. And please now join us for the next lecture where we will continue our exploration. Assalamu alaikum and God bless.